Hello there and welcome to another Bobeats video, and here today we're checking out the new SP-404 Mark II from Roland. Don't let the Mark II here in the name fool you. This is a huge upgrade compared to previous generation of SP-404s. Without making it feel like something else, it's still very much an SP-404. It has its own quirky workflow, but with some huge improvements to the design. There's some really big changes, which I think will be very welcomed by the SP community. So in today's video, we're gonna take an in-depth look at the SP-404 Mark II. I'm gonna tell you what it can do, what it can't do. I'm gonna show you how to make music with it. And yeah, all of the good stuff. So let's get into it. And also, yeah, big thank you to Roland for sponsoring today's video. So what is the SP-404? Well, it's a sampler and it's also an effects unit. And the idea is that you sample things into it, or you load samples onto it and you build up beats that way. It also has a sequencer, we'll get into it later, and it's a pretty interesting effects unit as well. And a quick comparison with the old SPs, the new one has 16 gigs of internal sample memory instead of just using an SD card, 32 voices versus 12 on the old one, 16 touch sensitive pads. Unlike the older SPs, it can be powered using a power bank, but it has to be an USB-C to USB-C power bank. The sample rate is 48 kHz versus 44 on the old ones, and there's a lot more sample editing functionality, and there's also the sample skip back functionality, which is kinda great. And you can have 4 effects active at one time versus just the one on the old SPs. And something that I think is very welcome is that it handles very long samples. So one sample can be about 16 minutes. It's especially well liked in lo-fi music circles, for example in lo-fi hip-hop, but it's not limited to that kind of music at all. And to show you, I've prepared a little demo here. The sounds in that little jam come from the sequential Take 5 synthesizer, and I sampled it into the SP-404. Then I loaded some one-shot drum samples, and I recorded a pattern into the pattern sequencer, and just played some sounds on top of it. So the SP-404 is primarily used in 2 ways. Either you use it to load or record samples and building beats on it, using the resampling functionality to add some grit, some vibe to the sound, or you use it as an effects processor for already sort of finished music, maybe for a live performance setup, because it has a pretty extensive effects section. So let me quickly make some music with SP, just giving you an idea of the workflow. And don't worry if it goes too fast, if you don't understand exactly what I'm doing, don't worry. It's a long video, I'll go through each and every step in detail further in the video. So let's start by recording a pad chord progression. And I want to use the filter, so I've enabled it. So let's resample. Hit resample. Let's select an empty slot somewhere. Let's see. There we go. Next up, let's go to the pattern sequencer. Here we have the little pattern that I recorded. Now I want to re-record this as a sample with some added effects. So I'll enable the vinyl simulator. And to resample this pattern, I press resample, select the pad. Next up, fix the start and end points. We can also truncate the sample. Boop, truncated. So now we have our little loop, and now we can play them together. So next up, if we want to add a bass line, there's multiple ways of doing it. We could take a little bass sound here. We could record a sequence and then sample the sequence. We could just record a loop with whatever we're playing here. Or we could resample it together with the beat. Now, resampling everything together is of course the most destructive way of doing it. So if you want more options later on, it's better to record it as a sequence or as its own loop. But we're gonna take the simple route here. We're gonna resample it and add some effects. Now that we got a loop going, what you start doing is adding effects, resampling the loop with the effects to create interesting variations. For example, we could create a loop with, say, a filter to make it an intro. Or perhaps add a high-pass filter and some reverb and create something like this. But to really understand what SP-404 is about, you have to get into resampling. So I took this upbeat pattern and I slowed it down and created something quite vibey. And of course, you don't have to take it that far, but I've found that the magic happens when you start resampling your loops and patterns and really try and add that sort of vintage vibe to them. That's where this machine here really shines. So how do you load samples into the SP? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You have a 16 gigabyte internal memory and SD card. So the SD card can hold 32 gigs of samples, and then you load them into the working memory of the SP-404, the 16 gigs. So that's the limit of what you can have loaded into the SP-404 at one given time. So each of the pads here houses a sample, and to load the sample you just select one of the banks here. So you can see they're yellow, and if it's grayed out it means it's empty. So let's go to an empty bank here. Let's hit Shift, Import from SD card, Sample. So here you can see the actual folders that I loaded onto the SD card. So let's find some drum samples and we can preview the sample. So let's load them. We select a pad. You can also hold Shift here to select multiple ones. Press the encoder again, and now we've loaded all of the samples onto the SP. So I mentioned projects, and if you hit Shift and Subpad, that lets you pick the project. And here you can see the ones that are lit up contains samples. So a project contains all the samples in the different banks, and that is in turn in the internal memory and not on the SD card. If we take number 1 here, this is a fully loaded project. And that's how quick you loaded it. And the SP actually comes preloaded with some pretty nice samples. And a new feature on the Mark II is that you can play samples chromatically, so you just hit Shift, number 4, now you can play a sample chromatically. Now when it comes to playing back samples chromatically, it's still monophonically, so you can't play chords from the chromatic mode, it's still just one sample at a time. Now next up, let's take a little look at resampling. So we have this kick here. Let's say you want to add some filter to it and resample it. We just hit filter. Say we like it like this, and now we hit resample. There's a metronome, but you can actually turn that off, and it's independent metronomes for, say, the pattern mode and the resampling mode, for example. So now we can see these blinking pads here. Let's hit one of them, and now we can just press whatever sample we want to resample it with the added effects. Hit record again. Now the recording is completed. Let's say we want a snare here with some reverb. Hit resample, hit the pad. Next up, let's make a drum beat out of these two samples using resampling. So I'm gonna enable the metronome again, hit resample. We have the metronome running. I'm gonna press this here. So now we have our little loop, and we can edit the start here as well as zooming into the waveform and editing the end. So let's see here. I know that the last hit here is the first kick. So let's put it here somewhere. And since I've enabled the loop here, it's just looping over and over again. So now we can find the little hi-hat here and use that to resample the loop here with the hi-hat. And if we're not happy, we can just press delete, press the pad we want to delete, and delete again to have it deleted. So let's re-record it again. So you notice how I always do the first beat when it repeats. That's because it's much easier to chop it up if I know where it starts again. So if I look at the waveform like this, I know that around here I should be able to loop it. And here's a really nifty feature. If you press roll when you have loop enabled, it'll play just the last part of the loop. So it's very quick to see if you looped it correctly. So let me show you here. So I don't have to go through the entire loop. This is actually super, super handy. So I just press roll to check if I set the end point of the loop correctly. So I set the end point here using this knob here. Press roll. And I noticed that it has looped correctly. So let's resample one more time, and let's add a bunch of effects to just show you what you can achieve. So by resampling, we've gone from to So since this is my first SP, it took a little while to get used to the workflow, and let me exemplify how I've been using it to create some music. So I usually just start off by loading or sampling some kind of external instrument into it. Got two very dark pad sounds or string sounds that are samples that I've loaded into it. We also got these samples here. And I loaded some drum samples, which I also resampled and changed up a bit. And then I got this bassy percussive sound. and I create this little rhythm. So together it's something like this. You can hear the stuttering, the tat-tat-tat on the pad. That's the scatter effect, which I applied just to create some rhythmic variations. That's one of my favorite effects. More about effects later in the video. And when I resampled it with some added effects and drums, it sounds a bit like this. And then you can just create different variations. So the pads here are just different variations of the same loop, basically. So that's one way to make music on it without using the sequencer even, just using resampling. But later in the video I'll touch on the sequencer and how to integrate that as well into your music making process on the SP. Next up, let's talk about sample editing, and this is also an area where there are some huge improvements over the older generation SPs. For example, the screen. So you can now see the waveform here. We can easily see and set the start, the end, the loop point. By turning this encoder, you can also zoom into the waveform pretty granularly and find nice starting points and end points that doesn't click. And should it click a little bit when it loops, you can always hit Shift and the envelope button. And here you can set attack, hold, as well as release. And with this button here, we can loop it on and off, or we can set it to gate mode. So gate, of course, works like this. When I release it, it releases. And if I turn off gate, it'll just be playing, and then I can loop it. I can also reverse it. I can resample a loop like this, for example, and then hit reverse in the middle of resampling to get some interesting effects. So let's see if I can do that. That's okay. So now we got a new loop. So let's go in and edit the start and end points. There's always a little bit of latency, so you might want to trim the start, and then you want to trim the end as well. And like I showed you previously with the technique, I always leave like the first beat so it's easier to find. And that way I can find the endpoint super easy. And now we actually have a menu here. So menu, we can press it, we can truncate, normalize, and emphasize. I think emphasize adds a bit of EQ, whereas truncate, cuts away the parts that you aren't using. So it cuts like everything before the start and after the end. And this is a good way to save on sample memory. Normalize normalizes audio to 0, but I don't use that a lot, so I just use truncate. But be careful. If it's not a lot of audio data, I would not truncate, because sometimes you think you got the loop right and then you want to go back and you want to change it. And then if you've truncated it, that's lost forever, basically. So yeah, be careful with truncating stuff. pretty good loop, I think. And when you have loop enabled here, we can also set a loop point. So when it loops from the loop point. So for example. So now's a good time to talk about tempo. So you set the tempo by hitting Shift, tap tempo, and here you can select project and bank, so you can have independent BPMs per project and bank. So basically the project and bank BPMs are like the master BPM, but you can also set the BPM individually for a sample. So this sample here is set to 99.7 BPM. So that's auto-detected, and we can press it here to set the range again. So let's try it. It detects it, 99.7. I actually think that BPM is closer to 100. So let's go manual. Let's change it to 100. I think 100 is where it's actually at. So it's pretty close because we also did the reversed thing. So yeah, maybe that threw it off a little bit, but it's generally pretty accurate. Now the sample plays at 100 BPM. But if it BPM sync, I've synced the BPM here of the sample to the project or bank BPM. So that way, when you load the sample, you can have the SP detect its BPM and then change the BPM using BPM sync to whatever project BPM you're using. So tempo syncing loops is actually pretty straightforward. Next up, I want to show you how to shop a sample, because it's actually one of the areas where there's been a lot of improvements over the older generations of SPs. So let's first load a song, because I think this is a great way to showcase it. So let's import here from the SD card. And yes, you can definitely load full songs into the SP. So here's a finished track of mine that I'm about to release. And as you can see here, it's a pretty long one. It takes a little while to load it. You could also do this using the software over on the computer, but I like to keep things on the SD card and load it manually. So now's a good time to grab that cup of coffee and just relax. So now I want to chop up the full song so I can play back different parts of the song, maybe remix it somehow, or just play parts of it live. So the easiest way is just press Shift, chop, and here we have the waveform. And now when I press it, it will start playing. So you see the pads have changed. We're in a different mode now. So when I press the pad, it will start playing, and then I can just press the pads here to enter marks. And then you can change the marks and chop it up. So I'll just enter the first mark when the beat drops, basically. So that's the first mark. That's the second mark. So now I can go in and change the markers per slice here. And when I'm happy, I press here, bringing up the menu, press Assign to Pad, and here I can just put down the slices I want. And then press Chop. So now we have the slices of the full track. And you could re-record that, add effects, and create some new loops. And just to show you here what I've done here, here's another track where I just sliced it up so I have different segments. And actually use those slices to create these variations. It's an easy way to remix and make something fun out of your existing music, for example. Now that's of course a very manual way of chopping things up. There's also the auto mode. So if we take a loop like this, we could go in here and we could select Chop, Menu, Auto Mark. So here we can select either time division, so it'll slice depending on time division. We could also set level as well as transients. And it's a little confusing, but hard basically means that it has high sensitivity and soft means that it has low sensitivity. Let's see here, automark, time divisions, let's set it to 4, enter. And we can of course go in and change the marks here as well. Now it's a good time to show you the mute groups. So Shift 8, here we can set mute groups. So we have different mute groups here, A, B, C, and so on. So we could select C, for example, it's an empty mute group. Press this here, the blink, go out. And now the samples will cut off each other. And we can resample and just create a new little loop here, something like this. So now it's a good time to talk about one of the newer features, which is skip back sampling. So you just heard me play this loop and play some chords on the sequential take 5 over it, and now I wish I had recorded it. Well, I sort of have, because we have this button here, mark. And if we press it, you can see here that something has been recorded. So it records about 25 seconds of whatever is going on. So if I just turn the start here, you can see my little progression. So now I just have to set the start point as usual, nothing fancy here. Set the end point and then save it. Then I press record, select a pad, and it's saved. So the skip back sampling is actually very useful. For example, if you're playing something, if you have external source here enabled, it's very useful. You could just play around and suddenly you realize that, yeah, the last take was really nice. I want to save it. But be careful, if external source here is enabled, that's always inputting a little bit of audio like noise and stuff. So turn that off immediately if you feel like you have a good take. Just turn that off. Now, another tip is that loopback sampling is actually really useful for just about anything that you're doing on the device. If you're fooling around with a couple of samples, and you want to record that and you haven't, you can just press mark and you have it there in the memory. Now it's a good time to talk about sampling from external sources. So you have stereo line in here on the back for sampling, and you have an instrument or microphone input with gain here on the front. So that's a mono input. Back here you have a stereo input. You could use just one of them as mono as well. And the device detects this and samples either in stereo or mono depending on the source. So you hit the external source here, and then you play something. And it goes through the effects as well. But when you record it, it's not saved with these effects. Instead, you actually have an input setting here. So you hit Shift and this button here. And now you can actually hit here and select an input effect. So we could have, say, auto pitch, vocoder, amp simulator, or just a bit of chorus. There's reverb, delay. We have the chromatic pitch shifter, the downer, warm saturator, the vinyl sim stuff, which is kind of vibey. So to edit it, you just go down here, you increase the flutter, for example, the noise. There's also a cassette simulator, the lo-fi, the equalizer, compressor. So you can apply one effect on the incoming audio and it will be recorded. Another important setting is the mix one. So mix means that you'll record a mix of the internal and external audio. And if you set it to external in, you'll be able to hear what's going on the device. For example, this beat here. And if I play something and record it, you'll only be recording the external input. And this is important for a very particular reason that we'll get into. When you are in the sequencer mode, and let's say you have a sequence playing, or you could even have a sample playing, and you just want to record, say, a guitar on top of it or singing on top of it, but you don't want to record it with the beat, then of course you have to set it to external in. That way you can record it while the beat is playing. So to do this, we press resample and not record. We press here, we start the loop, and it's recording. Hit record again. So now, if we check here, you can see that we've only recorded the external audio. This weak bass, but you get the idea. So that's the way you record on top of an existing loop, and it's the same principle when you're in pattern mode, that you have to use resample to do it. So if we instead just want to record a one shot or a melody or something without the beat, we can just press record, press a pad here. And now it's recorded. We can of course also record to tempo. So let's turn on the metronome. And that way we can easily get a perfect loop. So I left the last hit there, so you can use that to set the loop point. Next up, let's talk about the pattern sequencer, and it's located here under pattern select. And you see also that it says undo under it. So the undo functionality only works in the pattern sequencer when you are recording. So that's good to keep in mind. We'll return to that later. But under pattern select, we have a different mode for the pads. Each pad represents a pattern. So to record something, we press record here. And now we can select which pad we want to record into. And you can hear that the metronome is going off, so we can turn that off. At the core, the sequencer is pretty basic. So we have record enabled, hit a pad here, we get the little menu here. Now here we can set the BPM, we can also set the length. So you can see here 64 bars down to 1 bar, and the strength of the quantization here from 0 to 100. You can also set the grid here, the quantization grid. So you can see here we can have shuffle, for example. So there's many different settings here, or off if you want to do completely unquantized. Important to note, you have to set quantization before you record a pattern. You can't quantize after you've recorded a pattern. So before we record, let's enable count-in. I usually do 2 measures because this is, you'll see what this is good. It's good to have that time. And then we enable the metronome. So now we press record here. We set the length, so 4 bars. You have to do this every single time that you record a pattern. And then we press record and you get the little count-in. We can select the bank we want to use samples from. You notice that I just kept recording, and that's because, yeah, if it's set to record, it will just keep recording. You can also do rehearsal, so. And when you want to, you can just press record again. And I guess now is a good time to just show you the undo feature. So by hitting Shift and pattern select here, while we are recording, you can actually undo. And you see this little bar here. Those are the steps that you can record. So that those little squares here represent one press of a pad. So if I press undo here, you see, I'm basically removing hits of the hi-hats. Now, since I've recorded a bunch of stuff here that I'm not happy with, I can just hit delete here while it's set to recording. Hit delete. I can just erase. So I'll just hold down the pad that I want to delete. Now if we want to add some melodic elements, I'll just copy it over like this. Copy, press the pads, hit enter, and now we have a copy of the pattern. And that's good because it's kind of annoying to have to delete stuff if you're not happy with it, so it's better to start recording on a different pattern. Now here's another trick that I briefly want to mention. As you can see, when I trigger the pattern here and we go out to the sample select, you can see that it's triggering these samples. Now, what happens is if I exchange a sample for another sample, of course that'll be played instead. So say when I exchange this kick for this kick, just hit exchange like this. So now we got the more muted kick here. We can do the same for this snare here, like this. And now when we go back and play it, we get this more muted vibe. Now say we want to resample this pattern. We just hit resample and we hit an empty sample bank. So what we're seeing now is the sample banks. And we go back here into pattern select and we hit the pattern. And then we're taken back to the sample bank. And we have to go to the process of setting start and endpoints and all of that. So now we have our little loop here, but let's go back and let's record something else into the pattern just to show you here. So let's record some strings on top of this sample here. So it says waiting for record. So now we can go and find our samples, hit record, rehearsal. And when we're happy, hit record again. You heard me do something wrong there, so I'm just going to use the shift and undo and remove the two last hits. Now say that I want to jam along for whatever reason with this little beat here. What do? Well, I press external source here. And what you have to do if you want to sample an external instrument while you have something playing on the device, doesn't matter if it's a sequence, because a sequence is literally just samples playing, or if it's something resampled, a loop or something that's playing. What you have to do is hit shift, external source, set it to external in, like I showed you before when we talked about recording external instruments. So now when we trigger this little pattern here, we can actually play whatever we want and sample just that, just audio that's coming into the device. And we do this by enabling external source, hitting resample, selecting a pad, then turning on the little sequence. So now we're resampling. And we've recorded just the pad that I was playing. And now since I've resampled the beat and the pad, we can play them together. Now last in this pretty long video, we're gonna talk about the effects. And like I said previously, the old SPs, they had one effects processor and the new one has 4. So you can have 4 effects at one time. 2 of them are like performance effects. So basically we have the bus here, bus 1 and bus 2. So we can enable, say, a filter here on bus 1, and bus 2 we can enable, I don't know, say the reverb. Now there's also a setup menu, so you hit here and you go to EFX settings. So here we have bus 1 and 2. At the moment they are in series, but we can also have them parallel. You can also have favorites. So for example, my favorite number 1 here is an equalizer and a 303 vinyl effect. So those are like master effects, if you will, and you can go in and change the settings of them. So here we have bus 3 and bus 4 that you can change the settings of the 2 more passive effects, if you will. You don't have like hands-on control on the unit itself. We can also go here to direct, and here you can actually set up the effects for these buttons here. So we have 5 buttons here that you select whatever effect you want on them, and this is saved not per project, so it's globally saved, so you have like your favorite setup, if you will. So we can basically select between a number of different effects here, as you can see. I won't go over all of them. There are some really vibey ones. I don't have a lot of experience with the older SPs, so I leave it to other people to evaluate whether or not they sound as good as the older SPs, but I think that they sound really good. So the idea here is that you have an effects setup that you like. So 5 effects here, then you have the MFX, which is basically a selectable effect. So it's a quick select. So you can select between all the different effects that we have here. You can also use the buttons here to select an effect. So it's basically the same as on the old SPs. And say you want to record or resample something with your favorite effect, you just turn on favorite 1 or favorite 2. It's actually a pretty smooth process. Now let's do a practical example of how to use the effects. So here I have a pad that I've recorded into the SP-404. Now, let's say I want to resample this with some effects. Now I could just go in here, Shift, EFX settings. Let's pick favorite number 2, super hissy. We have a super filter, which will change the cutoff over time with like an LFO. We have the 303 vinyl effect, which gives some wobble. Now let's enable the reverb and hit resample. So now let's say we want to play this back or record something else without effects. Let's just go here, turn off and bypass the master effects. Another key thing to know about to speed up your workflow, especially when using effects, is the ability to set samples to send to the buses. So bus 1 and 2, they are independent, so you can send different samples to different effects buses. And this is very practical. For example, if you take this loop here, you can see that we have enabled this reverb here, but the reverb isn't applied to the drums, and that is because these samples here, you can see how they are grayed out or white. That's because they're not sending to the effects bus. So if we press effects bus here 1 and press remain, we can turn them on and off, the send to the effects on and off. And this is extremely useful. For example, if we want to take this pattern here, and we want to play the chords with effects over it or resample it, but just apply the effects to certain samples. So in some situations, turning off the effects send for certain samples speeds up the workflow, since you don't have to first sample, say, the pad with the effects and then the pad with the effects together with the drums. You could just do it in one go by sending only the pads through the reverb. So let's add some effects to one of the beats that we have, just to give you an idea of how I use it. There's like plenty of things you can do here with the effects. So let's start by adding some cassette simulation. And here we can set the age, the hiss, and change the tone, basically filtering. For most effects, there's also a secondary menu. So we just hit the effect here and hit this button here, and you can see that we can now change the flutter and catch and drive. So another favorite effect of mine is the scatter effect, because it adds some rhythmic variations. And lastly, we'll use the downer effects that I've set up on the MFX here to create some pitch variation. So if we just listen here closely, it basically pitches it down. But if applied quickly, it creates just a little slight dip in the pitch, which is, I guess it's interesting if you like this sort of broken down lo-fi vibe. So out of 10 things, let's of course record something externally on top of this, just resampling the beat here with some external sounds. And remember how I said previously that skip back sampling is awesome. Now I have used it again. I played a little thing here and I want to save it. I just go to skip back sampling and I find it here. And I can save it. So all in all, when you learn this device, it's actually very rewarding. It can be a little quirky. You have to get used to the workflow. You have to take it for what it is. But when you do, the magic just happens sometimes. And that's why I really like it. And here's an example of how I use resampling and external audio to turn the SP-404 into a quite vibey tape recorder. So this synth chord progression is made using the Take 5 and I sampled it. And then I resampled it using some of the onboard effects. And then I overdubbed it one more time with a lead sound on the Take 5. So I'm basically using the resampling here to resample both the internal audio as well as the audio coming from the Take 5 through the unit. So it sounds pretty vibey, I think. Key thing here is that when you're resampling the same part over and over again, also adding some different effects to it, you get a really nice and vibey result. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching this more tutorial style review, and let me end off with a few pros and cons. So the list isn't long. I think that Roland has actually done a really good job with this update to the SP. So I'm new to the SP lineup, but of course I've tried the older ones. I've also watched a ton of tutorials and reviews on the older generation to get an idea of what it is, what its limitations were back then. And I think, without saying too much, I think that Roland has delivered when it comes to the new SP Mark II. They've improved many aspects of it. It still keeps with the philosophy of the original SPs. It's not something totally different. The sequencer is probably the weakest point. It's just a basic recorder. You can quantize, change the start and end points, but that's about it. There's really not that much more you can do with it. It's very basic. You can chain patterns together, for example. It's like that on the original ones as well, and it's functional for what it is. It's meant to record samples. It's really nice for unquantized sample recording. So it's meant for that, and it's made easier on the new SP Mark II than it seemed to be on the older generations. And also resampling the sequences is much easier. Resampling a sequence while playing something externally is also a lot easier. Stuff like this is just much improved upon, but it still keeps with the philosophy of the original SP and some of its limitations. Another thing to consider is that if you're not into live recording beats live on the pads, then this is not really a sampler for you unless you want to use it as like an effects unit or to just remix already finished music like I showed you previously in the video, because the workflow on the SP is definitely geared towards live recording, and if that isn't interesting to you, then there's probably other options to consider first. And if there's one thing that tops my wish list for a future firmware update, it's to be able to play chromatically into the sequencer, because this is currently not possible. The effects are definitely one of the highlights for me. You get some really vibey results from them. Roland effects in general are pretty good. Some might seem a little cheesy, like if you overdo it, overuse some stuff, it'll sound a little cheesy, but with just the right amount, you can get some really vibey results, and I think that's why the old SP is also a very beloved device. It just has a certain sound, and I get it. I haven't used older ones much, but I really get it. So I can't speak to if the effects are better or worse than the older generation, but it's definitely like a vibey machine, and I really like the effects. I like that you can have 4 of them at once now. That opens up a lot when it comes to performance, so I think a lot of people will like that. Also, the sampling is pretty smooth, it's pretty quick. I wish it were a little bit snappier. Sometimes the graphics lag behind a little bit. You can still do things. So you can, for example, move the start point even when the graphics haven't finished updating. But I wish it was just a tiny bit snappier. I think this is a common problem on Roland devices, that sometimes the graphics lag behind. It's not a major thing for me, it's not a deal breaker, but I thought you should know it. I'm very happy with the sample editing features, how shopping samples work and stuff like that. So that's also, of course, one of the strong suits: recording samples, recording longer pieces of music, chopping it up, remix your own old stuff. That's been actually one of my biggest joys when I'm using this device. I hope I don't come across as too biased here, because when I started out, let me be very honest here, when I started out I was like super confused when I started with it, because it was new to me, but spending weeks with it, I literally spent weeks with it, it feels very interesting. It's very different from anything else I've used. It's its own thing. And if you can live with that, if you take it for what it is, it can be amazing, a lot of fun. And honestly, the price, it's very similar to some other multi-effects devices out there. And if you take that into consideration, you get a sampler, you get a recorder that can record long samples, you get a really nice effects unit as well, works as a USB audio interface. And yeah, it's just a really nice performance tool. And I mean, it's very nicely priced for all that you get. But of course, if you want like a more traditional workstation sampler, then something like the MC707, MPC-1 and the Machina Plus are better alternatives, because they have built-in synths, they have easier sample management and easier sample editing in some respects. So it's not a workstation, it's a creative sampler, and I think that it's brilliant at what it does. It does it really well. So yeah, what else can I say? It definitely gets my like approval for what it is. And if we were talking alternatives, the Circuit Rhythm and the Digitakt from Elektron are probably the 2 devices that I would compare the most to the SP-404 Mark II. Because they're creative samplers, you work within the limitations, they are beloved because of the limitations, not in spite of them. So yeah, those are devices that I would compare this to. They have different strong points and different weaknesses compared to each other, so I might make a little comparison video in the future if I have the time. Let me know if that's something you want to see. So thank you so much for watching this really long video. If you've stayed till the end, thank you so much. And big thank you to Roland for sponsoring today's video. Sometimes bringing sponsors on is the only way to make big projects like this happen, because it takes a ton of time. This video is probably really long. So thank you so much for being here. Talk to you later.